Thanks for being here. All right, awesome. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Deputy Director of Events at Politics and Prose, and I would like to welcome all of you to P&P Live tonight. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. First, I am dropping the link right now where you can buy Unspeakable Acts straight from Politics and Prose's website. And if you don't want to wait for it to be shipped, you can actually select in-store pickup to retrieve it from any one of our 3 store locations around DC. You can also ask any of our speakers a question by clicking on the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we ask that you put your questions there instead of in the chat so that Sarah can see them all in the same place and it's easy for her to read them. We're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can toward the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time and we can't address your specific question. All right, it is now my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's event, as I am a huge true crime fan and I've been looking forward to this event all month. Sarah Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita, which recounts the abduction of Sally Horner in 1948 and the case that inspired Nabokov's novel Lolita. She also covers book publishing for Publishers Marketplace and is the editor of tonight's collection. So let's join Sarah. Let's welcome Sarah to P&P Live, and she will actually introduce all the other speakers that are going to be joining us tonight. So welcome, Sarah.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you all who are here. I'm so excited to be moderating this event and launching my new anthology, which, yes, I'm going to do the whole, here it is. It's called Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession. And it is also my absolute pleasure to have several amazing contributors with me to talk about this anthology, their stories, true crime as entertainment, and true crime as a genre that frankly is in the process of evolving, and there's so many things to get to. So I'll briefly introduce them as they appear on my screen. So first up is Pamela Colloff. She is a staff writer at ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine. She's also under contract for a book that is based on the National Magazine Award winning The Deal with the Devil. And I think the book is currently having the same title, and I'm super excited to read it. She's based in Austin, Texas. Also with me is Emma Eisenberg. She is the author of The Third Rainbow Girl, a marvelous book that was just published by Hachette Books in January. And her story is, I Am a Girl Now. I'm sorry, I'm gonna mess up the title. So I'm gonna let Emma tell us what the title is when we get to it, but it is a wonderful, wonderful piece of true crime narrative storytelling. And I'm so excited that she is joining us. Also with me is Rachel Monroe. She is a contributor to The Atlantic, among many publications. She's also the author of Savage Appetites, a meta true crime book that was recently published in paperback. And she's coming from us from a backyard in Marfa, Texas, I believe. Last but not least is Sarah Marshall. She's the co-host of the amazing and timely and relevant podcast You're Wrong About, that challenges our assumptions and also entertains us in the process. She's written for The Believer and many other publications, and I'm so pleased to have you all here. And I hope I didn't bungle any of the introductions, but anyway, welcome. It's so great to see you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So I thought I would sort of go in order of more or less introduction. I wanted to know what drew you to telling crime stories and what drew you to telling the particular crime story that's in Unspeakable Acts. So why don't I start with you, Pam, and we'll sort of work our way around.
Sure. I think I've always been fascinated with anything dark. I don't know what Freudian reasons there are for that, but as a writer, I'm really interested in looking at stories in which ordinary people are thrust into extraordinary situations. And I feel like crime that's always the result in a crime story. And so I tried many different styles, many different types of storytelling. In recent years, I've done more looking at structural issues in the criminal justice system, which we can talk about later. but the story that's in the collection is a story called The Reckoning that's about a woman named Claire Wilson. And I had been wanting to write a story for a long time about the aftermath of a school shooting. And many years before I wrote The Reckoning, I did an oral history on the 1966 UT Tower shooting here in Austin, which was the Columbine of its day, really the first event of that kind. And during the course of that, I met Claire and heard her story. She lost the love of her life that day, and she was also shot. She was 8 months pregnant, and she lived, but her child died. And my story looks at 50 years of her life after that event. What were the repercussions of that? Not just in the months after or even the immediate year or two after, but decades later, how did it reverberate through her life? And so that's hopefully the story it tells.
And then Emma, moving to you with your story about Sage Smith, how did you come to write about her and to continue to sort of investigate what happened and what we don't know?
Yeah, I'm definitely like a accidental, not correct reporter in many ways, because I was, I was getting my MFA in fiction, and there were two big disappearances that happened around like a year apart, but with drastically different results. And the first was, this Black trans girl named Sage Smith, who went missing. And I was like sort of a reporter in the sense that like I was the person who like stopped you on the street and was like, what do you think of like this new froyo restaurant? You know, I was like, that's what I did in my like spare time. But then the paper was like, can you edit or like just like fact check this piece about Sage Smith? So they had covered it sort of, but with her dead name and with a lot of transphobic wording and a lot of just really poor, sorry if anyone's here from The Hook, reporting. And it sort of galvanized the sense in me of like, this isn't being reported well. And then I watched, as I was still a student at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, this white UVA student went missing, and the response was like the entire town looked for her and missed her and addressed her missingness as an emergency. And that was exactly what had not happened with Sage Smith's case. So it took me many years, and then I had already moved away actually by the time I heard from Sage's family basically saying like, we're tired of there being all of these articles about missing white girls, and Sage is kind of a footnote to that. Like they would do like, here's all the women who have gone missing on the Virginia corridor, and then they'd be like, NPS, there was also like a person who we don't really know how to describe because we're not really sure if she's a girl according to like our fact-checking department, but like we think we should put her in there. And so the family was like, no, we want a comprehensive story that's just about Sage. And so her case had not been, there had been no real breakthroughs on it at that point. That was like 3 years in. And so I worked for about 3 years with the family to kind of tell their side of it. Like, you know, they had not been contacted by police members. They were not able to get returned phone calls with updates about status of her case. And they were told, you know, like they wanted to buy a park bench in her honor, and the city was like, we're going to charge you for that. Like, you can do it, but you'll have to pay for it. So the way that they were treated was just so clearly about her being trans and Black and poor. So I just continued to be in contact with them, and eventually we came to a article that I think was, you know, was both true and also told a different kind of story. It was extremely difficult to get published, as I think you know, Sarah. I submitted it for years before anyone would take it, and the response was often just like, yeah, this is a worthy story. It's sad, but like, who cares, kind of. So it eventually, just after submitting it to like about 20 or so places, I found someone. It was really Dodie Stewart of Jezebel, she helped place it at Splinter at the time. So yeah, it was a weird long road, really fueled by Sage's grandma, Miss Cookie, who died before Sage has ever been found, but she was really the family advocate for the granddaughter, yeah.
I think I'm also just struck by this idea that we're not sure if she's really a girl according to the fact-checking department. I mean, that has to clang so badly back then, but now it just feels like even worse and like nails on a chalkboard that this is up for debate and question. And I guess before I move on to Sarah and Rachel, I just wanted, like, how, if you were starting that story now, would you approach anything differently, or would it be exactly the same approach from your end?
I think that, yeah, I would just be even more strident than I was at the time. Like, yeah, I was copy editing / doing some light fact checking on the story, and I was noticing that the reporter was using pronouns like willy-nilly. Like sometimes it was he, sometimes it was she, sometimes they would be like they, comma, a transgender person. Like it was just so messy. And I said, you know, you can't do this. Like you cannot just like switch the pronouns like haphazardly. Like this person is using she, her pronouns according to, you know, her family and stuff. And they were like, well, if we do that, then we'll have to run a guide on the sideline of the paper explaining what gender is. And I kind of like didn't fight it as much as I could have. And so I would say like, run the fucking guide now, you know, like if you need to do it, just do it. So I would be more self-assured, I think, in my interaction with that newspaper. And then I probably would have just known, you know, much better framing language of how to make the case for this being a really important story. Hopefully it wouldn't take 3 years to place now.
Right. So Sarah, with your story, you're taking a case that everybody thinks they know, and the story of a killer that everyone thinks they have some degree of opinion on based on whatever they've consumed. And you turn this completely on its head. And I just wondered, why did you pursue writing a story about Ted Bundy when there are zillions of Ted Bundy stories in all sorts of media out there? And how did you deliberately approach it by, I want to do something different, or did you just sort of fall into that?
Oh yeah, I definitely did it because there were a zillion Ted Bundy stories out there and they all got it wrong, and that drives me crazy. And because he has, over the years, become this very convenient pop culture boogeyman. And I think that, you know, the way that the media talks about Ted Bundy and sort of people who become archetypes in the way that he did is very timely, because he fits into the, you know, who will you call if there are no cops and Ted Bundy comes after you? And so to me, there was great importance in diving into the subject with the very strong suspicion I had when I started working that like even Ted Bundy isn't Ted Bundy. Even the like archetypal psychopath who people say when they just want to say psychopath, who became, as his own lawyer said, like as tissues, Ted Bundy is to serial killers as Kleenex is to tissues. He's the brand name that stands in for the generic. This is something his own lawyer knew about him and what he was becoming culturally in the 80s. So to me, you know, diving into the wreckage and looking at, you know, what statements he was actually making, the sort of factual accounts of what these trials were like, what it was like for his lawyers who had to work closely with him and were like, yeah, the guy's not well in the head. And he's not making good choices and he's not very smart. It drives me up the wall that there is this desire that we have in American culture to grade inflate the male serial killer and make him this like genius, better than human type person, which I think is also based on the idea that, you know, killing and harming somehow elevates us, which I think is really part of the gospel of toxic masculinity. So I felt like Ted Bundy was like at the center of this big Gordian knot that, you know, and then I had grown up with these myths, and it was in my interest to help younger people maybe get fewer of them, kind of coming in at them from all aspects of culture.
It's also really interesting to look at contemporaneous coverage, why is that word so difficult to say, of Bundy's crimes from the 70s, and then look at how coverage just inflated and became almost gargantuan in the early 80s. And I feel like that equates to when the thriller writer Thomas Harris was writing about serial killers. So I just want, yeah, I know, right? But it's like fiction writers have this tendency to make real life killers and criminals into these outsized monsters, when in fact they're just boring, banal old men. I think for all of us who have watched what has been happening with the arrest and now guilty plea of Joseph D'Angelo, who is now known as the Golden State Killer, and just to see this like pathetic specter of a man compared to the mystery of his crimes when we didn't know his name. It's like, talk about taking a horror balloon and puncturing it. So I just,
yeah, and it's a way of glorifying someone to say that they were a criminal mastermind, you know. And in the case
there are
of
no
Ted Bundy,
masterminds.
There are no masterminds, yeah. And if you can just show that someone wasn't caught because people weren't looking hard enough for him, then yeah, suddenly there's a new villain in town. It's very satisfying.
So finally, I can bring Rachel in. I chose your story because it was, to me, the exemplar of a common subgenre in true crime, which is the grifter narrative. And so I wondered what drew you to this story, and what are your thoughts in general about this subgenre, or how it can be done well, or especially how it can be done wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I, like Pam and probably like several other of you guys, was drawn to these kinds of dark stories pretty early on. But then there's a part of me that always kind of wants to analyze and pick apart and question why something is interesting to me. And so that has tended to be my favorite approach to true crime stories. And I apologize for my terrible internet. Hopefully
so far it's holding.
Okay. I keep getting ominous messages about it being unstable. But so just taking that kind of meta approach, thinking about what stories get told from what perspective. True crime is a genre with such often like rigid narrative tropes. The way the story is told, the pace at which it's told, the stock characters, something that this collection is obviously like exploding. But I'm just as interested in those tropes as I am in kind of picking them apart. And so I guess when this story, which was actually sent to me by my editor, it was just a very quick news story that there was a man who had conned a number of women out of money by going on dating sites and pretending that he was someone he was not. And it struck at a very particular time when I had somebody very close to me had actually been a victim of a situation like this. And so it was a phenomenon that was just kind of in my head. And the thing that became so interesting to me, and I think is a real common aspect of these grifter narratives, are even when they are ostensibly condemning the con man, there's often a lot of affection or maybe affinity for the grifter. We're often told the story sort of, they're the mind that we're interested in, kind of like Sarah was saying about the male serial killer. There's the idea that there's something really like brilliant or kind of fun or devious or subversive about what they're doing. We want to know their tricks, and I think that comes from a real deep human fear of identifying, I think, with victims, which would require, I don't know, thinking about or admitting our own vulnerability to things like this. And so because I had this experience with this person who was very close to me, I knew, you know, I felt like I knew, anybody could fall into this situation. It's not, all of the women that I interviewed for the piece were very, very aware of those tropes and were very insistent, you know, you can't tell this like this is a story of these foolish women. So that was interesting to me that they were aware of the storylines that they were potentially going to be written into. But then the thing that was interesting to me was that even as I come into this wanting to write a grifter story that has some awareness of the genre and its pitfalls and who we tend to identify with, I still had this moment where it was an extended period in the reporting of the story where the con man himself was sort of promising me access. He was going to explain it all to me. He was going to give me access to his emails, and I felt for them, not as in a romantic way, but there's that part of reporting that can sometimes feel like romance when you feel like you're going to get access to the good stuff. I was like, if I could quote from his emails, like, oh, this is going to be incredible. And it took me, even as a person who was writing a story about a con man, aware of the con man tropes, it was incredible to me how I also fell into this pattern that so many people do. And so I guess I was hoping in the piece to kind of not only give attention to these crimes, which are like the most, these romance scams are on the FBI list is like the #2 kind of highest grossing financial crimes, but also to think about why it's so common for so many of us to think that happens over there to someone else and not to me.
I mean, I feel like we all have a possibility and a propensity for falling for this stuff. I'm thinking of Maria Konikova's book, The Confidence Game, which gets at some of the psychological underpinnings for why we keep falling for grifts, even if we think we know better. And before I move on to the next subject, I can bring Pam back because I feel like, were you wrestling with this in the long piece that you recently published? I mean, I remember you were you told me, I want to write a story about a con man, and then it sort of took off. So I wondered if, like, with that being perhaps a driving point, but really there was so much more going on.
Yes, and actually the end of Rachel's story mimics exactly what happened to me. The same, I won't repeat it, but the same story that the person I was writing about told me he was going to tell me everything. He told me I'd win a Pulitzer. It would be this groundbreaking, amazing story. And I gleefully called my editors to tell them after visiting him in federal prison about this. And it took way too long to realize that my letters weren't getting lost in the prison mail. He just wasn't gonna give me the goods. So I do think it's interesting, and I think just one thing about reporting on those particular types of crimes, which I had not done before until this story, but which is now the subject of my book. But there's a lot of, there's different crimes carry different kinds of shame for victims. And one of the things that has been a big learning curve for me on this is the type of shame that is attached to being tricked and conned. And one of the main things I've done in trying to reach out to the many people who he harmed over the years was to let them know that they weren't the only one, which many of them thought they were, that this was part of this decades-long pattern. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, again, exactly what Rachel was talking about, but is to demythologize what that figure is like. It's not Catch Me If You Can. It's so painful. If you make someone fall in love with you and imagine a life with them, and then that turns out to be a lie, that's so damaging, so.
I feel like this is a good segue to talking about how true crime kind of builds up mythologies. And Sarah got into it a little bit when we were talking about serial killers, but I feel like this just happens over and over again, especially with certain crime shows that they're devoted to a linear narrative, to the tropes of the dead white girl, to the evil perpetrator, to the heroic cop, to everything is getting solved. And once they're put away, that's the end of the story. And I think what the strengths of all of your work, and hopefully all the pieces that are in the anthology, is that they really subvert this idea of mythology. And I just wondered, I really want to hear from each of you about what your thoughts are with respect to true crime as a means of entertainment and the problems of that, and how we're interrogating those issues, but maybe we haven't interrogated them enough.
I would say that, passing a judgment on true crime as a genre is like passing a judgment on love stories, right? Like if you're saying like love stories are bad, it's like, well, there are so many things that you could possibly mean by that. And there are love stories that like reinscribe dangerous cultural values and make people more likely to double down on behavior that is only allowing them to harm themselves and be harmed by others. Or you can take the same subject matter and explore it in a way that subverts those ideas. And so I feel like, one of the things I think we're experiencing now, and I think that the content of the anthology speaks to that is that, you know, we're recognizing that true crime has always been as complex a genre as it's just starting to sort of allow itself to be.
Rachel, this would be a good time to bring in Savage Appetites, and particularly the sequence that's sort of spread out over the book where you're at CrimeCon. And I've never been to CrimeCon, but I have been to smaller true crime conventions. And I remember covering one, I think it was for Vice a million years ago. And really I was trying to figure out for myself who are the people who attended and why they were there. And for you attending this and this larger issue of who consumes true crime and why, what sort of conclusions, or better yet, what questions did you arrive at?
I mean, I think the thing to me was that there was an interesting tension happening at CrimeCon between the kind of pressures of the structure, the superstructure of the event, which is put on by a cable TV network. And so it's structured as a fan convention. And so you have a lot of wine and crime happy hours and, you know, get your selfie with in a sort of mugshot. And the idea there is to make everything feel kind of light and good, even if we're talking about really terrible things. And that felt really like troubling and disturbing to me. But then the thing that was interesting was within that kind of alarming superstructure, the people at this convention, there were plenty who were just there as like, you know, bachelorette party, like actually doing a bachelorette party at CrimeCon, and which incidentally I had heard that CrimeCon was supposed to be on a cruise this year, but that didn't happen because of coronavirus. But, you know, imagine like bachelorette CrimeCon cruise, like that kind of scene. But then there were plenty of people there who, you know, there was that great article in the Washington Post about a man who went there to try to drum up attention for his sister's murder, which had never been solved. Or you had people who were really invested in wrongful convictions. Or so the people who were there had a kind of more diverse and complex relationship than I think the commercial entities that were structuring the event would have preferred. And so there was a very simple surface and a more complexity and messiness going on underneath. And that was something that appealed to me because I think these stories are compelling for all sorts of reasons. Some of them noble, some of them pretty repellent, and a lot very much in between. And it's that in between that's much more interesting to me and seems worth that I was trying to think about in that book.
Yeah, I mean, in between in general, I think is also a hallmark of Emma's book, The Third Rainbow Girl, because I still remember when you would quote your Goodreads reviews of that book and how they kept trying to shoehorn the book into a genre and fail. And of course, I love that book, and I think most people do, is precisely because it blurs the lines between so-called genres and everything is sort of working together. And I just wondered, is hybrid storytelling a more natural way of being and a more honest way of telling crime stories?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think I said this before, but I just tend these days to gravitate. I mean, everyone here, I think you can feel the stamp of their consciousness and their positionality in the work. And I feel like I tend to gravitate most these days towards work that has a more thick narrator, a narrator that makes clear who they are and not necessarily like why they're interested in a like A to B kind of way, but a more like, what does it mean and why are we doing this, as opposed to just let's look and be a voyeur. Like even Patrick Radden Keefe, who wrote the intro for this anthology, his book Say Nothing does that at the end of thinking about, you know, why is this a story that we want to look to and be with, rather than this is just a story that's there for entertainment. And I think Rachel's book does that so well in terms of thinking about the tropes of true crime. And I'm really interested right now in the trope of the investigator or the police officer. And I think that's becoming extra fascinating right now in this moment of thinking about like, who are the police and what does it mean to be a good police officer or a bad police officer? And I think I tried in my book, The Third Rainbow Girl, to like look at the investigator too and be like there was police coercion, there was, just laziness. And the same is true in the Sage Smith piece that's in the anthology. There's like the cops that I spoke to they're not like fascinating or the good guys. Like in the Sage Smith piece, they're guys who are overworked, who are on the edge of retirement, who like could not give a shit, and who were like in this strange positionality of having to police, being white guys who have to police a city that is majority white, but that the people they're stopping and frisking and interacting with are nearly 100% Black. And that when they look at folks' faces, like people that are missing or who have been victims of crimes, like they make a lot of assumptions, like right there, just looking at who those folks are. So a big thing in the Sage Smith piece was that they assumed she was a runaway, that she had run away, and boohoo for her, kind of like. So they did not treat her with an urgency of this is someone who has been taken or harmed. They saw her Black and they knew her family as someone who had come across like law enforcement radar, and decided that her story was not one of being a victim of a crime. And I did ask them at some point, like, how many trans people have you ever interacted with? And the two cops I spoke to were like, yeah, a bunch, And I was like, but how many of them have been victims of crimes? And they were like, 0, So I think this idea of like unpacking the investigator as less like, I think as Alice Bolin put it so well, like pseudo-sexually involved with the victim, and more as like representing a wide range of positionalities, including antagonistic, including racist, including lazy, including overworked, including part of a larger system in which policing is failing. I think all of that stuff is like super fascinating right now.
Yeah, I mean, oh no, go ahead, Pam.
I think what's so interesting, and this goes also to some of the reaction to your book, Emma, which is such an incredible book, is that when you explode some of those myths or you play with the genre, it can make readers mad. It's not always welcome. And I wrote a piece several years ago in which I was trying to explode the myth of what I'll call the CSI industrial complex by looking at the lack of science in forensic science. And the response on Twitter, I mean, the number of people still to this day who will write to me and say like, Dexter wasn't real, who are like really, really upset. And I just think that's interesting. And I think as we sort of explode these myths more, which I expect in years, given everything that's going on right now, it'll be interesting whether people, I think will be more receptive to that now, but it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I wanted to sort of bring up was the most recent You're Wrong About episode, which was just beautifully titled Murder. Because to speak to Emma's point, and what came up in this episode is how there is this myth of the homicide detective who is so capable and solves everything. And homicide detectives are not solving anything. And clearance rates are ridiculously awful. And so understanding how police aren't doing their job and why is so paramount. And I wonder, in like producing this episode and thinking about what's been happening, and we'll get into that in a little bit, it sort of upended your own thinking as well, Sarah.
I mean, I wasn't very surprised by any of the information given to me in the episode, but it's more the kind of thing where like, you understand how like with my plants, like I understand on some level that like the more sun they get, the more water they need. I don't know why that is scientifically, but like I can feel it to be true. And so I feel like this episode was really like, it was taking apart, and I think this is something that is going to be a feeling a lot of people share. And I think that this is kind of part of the fun of the experience. You feel yourself surrendering these myths that you had passively allowed to remain in your head because of pop culture narratives. Like one statistic that did surprise me was that like 8% of murders are solved, or like suspects are found because of forensics. Like the rest of the time, it's like you already know who you're looking for, and then you're like, okay, the fingerprints or whatever. And that was something that, like, once I accepted that figure, I was like, yeah, that fits with the whole picture I have. But it's like being surrendered from this intact pop culture picture that just like, that hadn't fallen away. And then once it does, you're like, well, 8%. And so there's just this interesting thing where you realize that, like, even as your political sensibility is being developed, and as you're working on understanding the world as it is and accepting that information in, like, you still just have these ideas from pop culture and from fiction that, like, you don't presume to be true, but you don't ever specifically think about how wildly untrue they are. And then when you do, you know, get shown that, you're like, I mean, yeah, like it was all a wild story, but the wild story is just so profoundly punctured by facts in a way that just being told, because yeah, I guess in the way that facts do. Facts are often the enemy of story, which I think is why we don't encounter them as much as we might think we would.
And for a genre that really privileges story in a way over facts, I think true crime really has to go through what may be an extremely uncomfortable reckoning, but I think it's one that's long overdue. And that sort of leads me, I hope naturally, to a question that I had posed to each of you as we were preparing for this conversation, which is that obviously in the last couple of months in particular, first obviously the pandemic, but then the ensuing protests in the wake of various police killings, is there a story that you've worked on that you would do differently now because of how you approached sort of systemic racism or larger criminal justice issues? And obviously the fact that we are 5 white ladies talking about true crime is extremely part of this issue that faces this genre if it's to go forward in a healthy fashion. So Pam, I'm going to put you on the hot seat and start with you.
I mean, I would go back and do so many things differently. I feel like I have to live with the constant reminder of my failures because I get calls from Discovery ID about stories I did 15 years ago routinely.
That's gotta be weird.
And that to me, I'm sorry, Discovery ID fans, but that to me is like the kiss of death. That's like, you did the story wrong because Discovery ID loves it. I wrote many, I entered this industry in the 90s. So what a typical crime narrative was then is very much of the, had many of the problems that we're talking about. And I certainly wrote stories in that vein beginning with the dead white girl. And there's one I wrote in 2002 called A Bend in the River that was just a classic, like there wasn't any larger purpose to the story. It was a very sad and sadly very interesting story about 3 teenagers who had killed another teenager. There wasn't anything redeeming about it. There wasn't any larger whatever. And that's the quintessential story that I've done like that. And interestingly, I actually went back years later and tried to do a smarter take on it. It's a story that got a lot of attention at the time, the original story. What I did was the prosecutor in that case, who I'd stayed in touch with, was very tortured over the fact that the least culpable of the 3 defendants, who was 17 at the time of the crime, that this prosecutor had sent him to prison for life. And as he had watched his children grow and realized what, being a 17-year-old is, it gave him pause about what he had done. And the story explores his remorse in that, and it ends with the conversation he has. He goes to meet with this man many, many years later who was 17 the last time he saw him, or, in his late teens. And interestingly, that story had 0 traction. But I just think the original story had bothered me. Like, why did I put this out into the world? And now that it's out in the world, what can I do to make it something that makes people think more deeply? So there are many stories like that I wrestle with.
Rachel, what would that be for you?
It's a question that you tortured us with when you start looking back at those stories that you've written. It's really had a nice couple days thinking like, oh yeah, and then I did that, and then I did that. But it's a very good exercise. We should all do it. The one that came to mind for me was a piece that I wrote early in my career for the no longer existent magazine Pacific Standard, and I had been fascinated by a famous within his field forensic psychiatrist who was trying to make a kind of forensic instrument that would allow him to quantify evil, because certain crimes are given maybe eligibility for the death penalty if they reach a certain level of like depravity. And so he was trying to, what he was really trying to measure was depravity, but he talked a lot about evil, I think, because it was a sexier way to talk about it. And that was really intriguing to me from a kind of philosophical, theoretical standpoint. Does it make sense for us to be talking about evil? What are these highly charged, highly emotional, all kind of religious language doing in our legal structure? What would it even mean to kind of measure this on a point scale? But and I touched on this in the piece, but I wish I had gone into it more, the way that these scales and algorithms and instruments are so racialized, and they are often when we're talking about things like depravity, probability of re-offending, or like Sarah talks about in her essay, psychopathy, that there's like such a great point in that essay that you make, Sarah, where you talk about some of the points on the psychopathy checklist are like, have you committed crimes before? And then if we're thinking about a heavily biased criminal justice system, then this like ostensibly objective instrument has this bias like so baked into it. We're just like weighting it to tell us that Black and brown people are like more psychopathic or something, and that's just like all of these kinds of bias built into these systems that present themselves as kind of distanced or objective. And so I think I had in my heart and my brain a kind of like an inkling that was something that was wrong with this idea of measuring evil. But I don't think that I had the awareness, honestly, like I wasn't sort of as steeped as I am, or as I have like grown to be in the history of how these things are used. And so I think that really limited my analysis of it. And so looking back on it, I think I'd love to write about him again. He's interesting, and do a better job this time.
I mean, some subjects do demand you revisit them every so often because we grow and change, so our perceptions will also grow and change. Sarah, I know that your answer is not a magazine piece or a text piece, it was a podcast episode. Mm-hmm. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, this was a podcast episode, a two-parter that I did, I think 3 years ago now, about the Supreme Court case McCleskey v. Kemp, which had experienced its 30th anniversary. It was actually, the decision was handed down on my birthday, a year to the day before I was born. So I got to go around interviewing, people, being this like human example of how much time had passed, which is an interesting thing to be, especially because I got so big. And that was a case where essentially, famously, after the reinstatement of the death penalty, the first kind of study that looked at all of the data in the state of Georgia and at all of the executions that had taken place in the state of Georgia found that there wasn't a direct correlation to the race of the defendant who was executed, but there was a correlation to the race of victim, and that you were 4 times likelier to receive the death penalty for being convicted of killing a white person than for being convicted of killing a person of color. And so the Supreme Court case was based on taking the case of the specific man named Warren McCleskey, who in my opinion was also actually innocent of the murder of which he was convicted, and taking this to the Supreme Court and being like, hey, it appears that we're handing out the death penalty in Georgia in a way that we can show with math to be racially unjust. So like, are you guys concerned about that at all? And the Supreme Court was like, no. And that's the story. And so, and for this story, predictably, the people involved in the prosecution of this case were not interested in talking to me, and sort of gave me just a gentle brush off. And I was like, fine. And Warren McCleskey's family and his lawyers and another lawyer who I talked to about a progressive progressive approach to the death penalty in North Carolina were extremely interested in talking to me. And so it became a piece that to me, my investment in it was in centering the pain of Warren McCleskey's surviving family. And the centerpiece of it was a long interview with his daughter. And looking back on that now, I think like, well, that's, I'm happy with the work that I did, and I did the best that I could. But if I had been a better reporter, and if I had been, if I had, been more courageous or been more aware of kind of the dimensions of what I was doing, like I would have tried harder to talk to the people who helped kill him. And I failed to do that. And that's, that's also just, I think, I blame the lack of perspective that I think reporting on that story was what gave me the perspective that I now have to do a better job with it. So I think all of that is my way of, Sarah, agreeing with your point that like, we revisit things. And I think that, they're just, the idea that you're gonna do justice to something the first time is like, it's a freeing idea to surrender, I think.
I mean, I'm thinking now of the first major true crime feature that I tried to do, which was on actually a Philadelphia case, The Boy in the Box. Because at the time, this is how long ago, it was for the 50th anniversary in 2007. And I was such a baby reporter, I had no idea what I was doing. And I was following in the footsteps of another reporter and talking to the same sources, and they would bring up this reporter as how great she was. And I was just so young and unformed, and I look back and I don't cringe at that, because I didn't know. I had to teach myself how to be a reporter. But I do think of stories, especially those where it involved Black perpetrators or Black families, where I felt understandably, but still not necessarily forgivably, that I couldn't go as far as I would have liked, because why would they talk to me? I'm not in the community. I am an interloper, or could be perceived as such. And even if I come in with some kind of open heart and mind, there are going to be limits, which is, I think, why it's so important to open up the floodgates to all sorts of true crime writing and storytelling and coverage that is from the communities, by the communities. And Emma, I didn't mean to hijack you, but I know that for your Sage Smith piece, we've already talked about what you might do differently in 2020 versus 2017, but what do you hope for as the genre keeps evolving? And is there a good future, or are we still going to be mired in tropes?
Well, I think that there is a good future, and I've been trying to do, especially during the pandemic, where I feel like we've just seen such reckonings in lots of industries, including media and publishing. And I love that, and I'm excited about it in lots of different ways. But one of them is, I think, thinking about obviously race and Blackness and anti-Blackness, but also gatekeeping and access. And I've basically just been like, you can do it. Like, you don't have to go to journalism school and spend $120,000 at Columbia. Like, you can be a reporter. Like, I am not even really a great trained reporter. Like, unlike many of these folks, like, I've only really written 3 or 4 big stories because I'm really slow and it takes me a long time. And I also publish in other genres, but I just feel like breaking down the mythology around who gets to be a reporter and what that means is really huge in terms of having stories that come from the communities they're about, and just like thinking, like, I think people think there's some magic to reporting, but it's like, it's just like oral collection. Like, you just go and talk to people. And there, of course, there are certain, everyone has their own style. Everyone here has their own style and their own forms of expertise and relationships and trainings. But I think essentially, like, it's not rocket science. It's just, you go and ask people questions and you make knowledge that because no one had ever asked them those questions before. And I think that was really clear in the Sage Smith piece, because her family came to me and were like, literally no one has ever asked us these questions. And there was so much local journalism going on at that time. But I think there was a sense of like, how do we find a reporter who will do a good job, and or how will we make a reporter be interested at all? Like, that question of just like how reporters are interested in stories, I'm interested in that also. And I'm trying to think about ways to be kind of a bridge. Like, people do often say like, will you write about this thing for me? And I'm sure everyone else on this call too gets like DMs and emails about like, will you sort of take my case? And I'm really not in a place where I'm going to say yes to that right now, but thinking about how I can almost like match make people, or think about trying to be a kind of bridge with whatever platform I have to amplify the stories that are out there that haven't yet found a writer or reporter who wants to take them, and then think about all the people in their own communities who would be such great shepherds for those, and then what skills do they need to make that story a reality. So I'm interested in thinking about like training for writers as well, and bring that kind of a bridge between people that have stories and people who know how to tell those stories.
Emma, I want you to have a think tank.
I do too. So
Yeah.
I feel like we could
we make that
easily be talking for hours upon end, but I do want to get to at least a few questions in the chat. So the first one from Julia is, if you could solve a famous unsolved case, which one would you choose and why? What do you think would happen if you chose that case?
I have a first thought, which I bet a lot of people are going to have, which is that I would solve the Zodiac killings, and I would show that the Zodiac is some boring goofus, because they all are. And then we could finally move on and just stop acting like it's cool to send puzzles to people.
So that is also why I've never, ever written about Zodiac, because it was such charted territory.
I'm going to go ahead and just give one more plug for the story, which is that I would solve the Sage Smith case, which is the case that's in the anthology. Like, her killer has still not been found. And again, her grandma was the one who was really her advocate for years. And her grandma suffered stroke after stroke and heart disease and liver failure and died last year, or about 18 months ago. And just the toll that holding that kind of pain takes on the body, I wish that that were not in vain. So I hope that there's lots of other people in Charlottesville, in the Black community, in the trans queer community in Virginia, who really want that case to be solved. And so I really hope it does.
I was just going to say a similar answer, that yes, it would be interesting to know who killed JonBenet Ramsey and all sorts of other famous cases that we really will never know the answers to. But I always had this idea that like someday when I die or before then, that maybe all of the mysteries of the stories I've worked on would be revealed to me. Like, especially because I write so much about wrongful convictions, I can guess at what happened, but I'll never fully know, unless there's, you know, DNA evidence, what really happened. And there's certain stories and cases I think about a lot to this day that I'll never really know, no matter how hard I tried to crack it. So for me, they're less the famous ones than the ones I've wrestled with.
And I think, Rachel, you didn't have a chance to answer this, so what's your unsolved case?
I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, like Pam, the ones that just when you work on a wrongful conviction, so just thinking about the West Memphis 3, that's a case that I have thought about from the perspective of the people who got wrongfully convicted for it. But you can't forget that there is there are still a triple murder there that of 3 young boys that remains unsolved.
And for me, back in my native Canada in around 1984, there was a 9-year-old girl named Christine Jessup who had been murdered, and her neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, was arrested. First, he was tried and acquitted, and because the criminal justice system works differently in Canada, he was eventually retried and convicted, and then DNA exonerated him, and the case has never, it's just been sitting there. And it just makes no sense. There's evidence. This should be solvable, but there's no will. And that's a sort of a larger theme that I think about a lot, is why is there often no will to solve solvable cases? So there was a really good question, I think from Sabra, which is, do you think there's a feminization inherent in the genre of true crime and the way it's marketed? For example, it puzzles me that Mastermind, a book by Evan Ratliff, was marketed as a political tech thriller and not true crime. And there are a number of other questions just about why women are so interested in true crime, and just talking about this sort of feminization would be particularly interested. So if there's anyone who's dying to answer that question, if not, I'm going to pick Sarah.
I think that this is a question with like many answers, and we can all put something into the stew here. But I would say that one dimension of that is that there's, I think, a lot of pandering in the market of true crime to women, and this like, ha ha ha, they shouldn't be interested in this, but they are, and it's hilarious. And it's like, it's really not that bizarre that like half of the population is interested in crime, which is like such a broad thing that it folds in, it folds in violence, it folds in murder, it folds in serial killers, which are like a huge industry within, popular culture. I mean, I've been watching the Saw movies this week, and it's just like, yep, that's just, you want to make money at Halloween, serial killers, that's it. They're just going to make you some money. So I feel like there's like a bizarre amount of emphasis on female interest in true crime because it's like considered somehow noteworthy that women are interested in crime narratives at all, especially if there's like something, gory or unladylike involved. And so it's weird to me that it's something that is commented on, because it feels like like before we were in this phase of, people saying that true crime was having a moment, which you kind of, are like long moment.
Centuries long.
It's a long ass moment. Yeah. Before we were commenting on the fact that true crime was having a moment, I remember people being like, well, Sarah, like, why are you interested in true crime? But before it was just kind of accepted that it was a broader interest that a lot of people share. And I was just like, we're all interested in it. And I'm just admitting that I'm interested in it. Like, there's no one who's like fundamentally uninterested in crime unless they're like so tired from like looking at crime for their job that they come home and they just want to watch Bob Ross, which is like not the same thing as being uninterested in it.
Does anyone else want to take that? And if not, then we have time, I think.
I have been thinking about this, because I think, like Sarah is saying, crime is a huge subject, but what gets slotted into this category of true crime, which is a publishing category, right? And a marketing category, maybe more than anything else, is, I think, maybe is a more limited and a more narrow kind of story. And when I think about true crime as a genre or as a trope, it's often a way of thinking about crime that's doing that's examining a murder or something as almost like a psychodrama. It's wondering about the psychology of the perpetrator, and things like that, and leaving out maybe a lot of like structural questions, or the things that Pam writes about. I think in some ways, like, Pam, your work doesn't neatly fit into that, what people think of as true crime, because it is engaging with those questions of justice. And so I think hopefully what we're all trying to do is kind of explode that a little bit. And so thinking of crime, describing crimes in terms of like relationships, as, you know, thwarted romances. That's certainly like a true crime trope. But I have also been thinking about how the genre, the whiteness of the genre is also part of this, is marketing and categorization, and thinking about how many books are out there. I've been like on a real John Edgar Wideman kick, and I was thinking today, I was like, these books are never on true crime lists of the best true crime. Gorgeously written, really like super thoughtful, really in some cases like very intimate books. But his book about Emmett Till, his book about his brother, you know, books with murder in them. Excuse me?
The Move Bombing, that was John Edgar Wideman's book, so that's fair.
Exactly, but they're not, and so these are books about crimes, right? But they're not, I think, because the subjects are Black and or the writer is Black, those are somehow considered like slotted into like, oh, that's a different kind, that's political, right? If we're writing about white people, somehow that's like not political, or that is like that it's psychological, it's not thought about in a sort of structural way. It's that psychodrama kind of story. And so the things that are, or I was thinking about Melissa Del Bosque's book about the cartels and the relationship with horse racing, like another, like so fascinating and so fun, but also it doesn't kind of, it's not easily thought within this category. And I think that's just like the limited, I don't know if that's marketing, that's all of us kind of imbibing the marketing and kind of unconsciously replicating it, what we think of as being, as fitting into true crime or not true crime. So I think there's like a huge gender component to that and a racial component to that. And there really doesn't have to be.
I also want to chime in as a rec for James Baldwin's The Evidence of Things Not Seen, because that's a book that I think was profoundly misunderstood when it was published in 1985. It was about the Atlanta child murders, but really was about systemic racism and all of the subjects that Baldwin had spent all of his life writing about so well. But I feel like it's only now that we're even beginning to understand his project and this particular project in general. So that actually leads pretty well into this other question from an anonymous attendee. Let me find it. When the American legal system is stacked against Black folks and poor folks, how do we demand resolution in true crime stories that are not related to prison? I mean, that's a really good question, isn't it?
I think that, I mean, this highlights the fact that story is the enemy of justice in many ways, because if you want to resolve a story, you send someone to prison. And, you know, I recently, you know, was working on a piece about criminal minds, and like, that's an archetypal, you know, police procedural find the killer show. And those motherfuckers always get shot at the end. Nobody goes to trial. There is one scene in a courtroom in that show in 15 years, because they figured out, I think in a way that was somewhat wise, that like they needed to depart from the legal system altogether to like maintain this beautiful fantasy world of like, you find the killer, he's about to commit another murder when you find him, and you shoot him and kill him. And like, that to me is the true crime narrative at its most honest. Like, it is about finding the bad person and killing them. And so if you send someone to prison, then like, that's a narrative proxy for killing and for doing the narratively satisfying thing. And so I feel like we have to really question all of our ideas about what narrative is doing for us and what we're doing with narrative. And I think, you know, this is one of the problems that we see when popular media shapes perceptions to that extent, and also when journalism, what kind of journalism editors are interested in publishing, what kind of journalism is worth someone's while financially. Like, that will often, in my personal experience, and I doubt that I'm alone here, will be shaped by, you know, what makes a good story, and how we evaluate what makes a good story has a lot to do with what kinds of stories are familiar to us and how we think these stories have to conclude in order to be satisfying or meaningful. And I think that that is underestimating what audiences are capable of appreciating or desiring, because we know pretty reliably what's profitable, but that's a different question.
I think too, yeah, absolutely, Sarah. Yeah, very well put. And I think also like the question had poverty in it centrally in the question too of like, how do we hold systems to account? And I'm not sure that I've done a great job necessarily in my stories, like identifying ways of accountability or like action steps around what's going on, but something that I have been thinking about poverty in terms of true crime stories a lot lately. And I feel like what I tried to do, at least in a couple of the longer pieces I've worked on, is like more about like what happens before the crime, like just like more before, and more human stuff, and more stuff about like both the victim and of the crime and the perpetrator. Like, where were they staying? What were they eating? Like, how much money did they have? What jobs were they allowed to have? What jobs were they fired from? Like in the case of the Sage Smith piece too, like people often say like, well, so she worked as a sex worker sometimes, which is a big reason that people didn't look for her when she went missing. And I try, at least in the piece too, to be like, well, why was that? Like, these are all the jobs that she was refused from. These are all the ways that her learning disability was not identified in school. Thus, she was not able to get a GED and all of these things. So like thinking about just spending more time, I think, with the details, like not just saying like this person was poor and poverty is linked to crime, but being like, what does that mean in a detailed way? And I think that's a reporting issue, like when a lot of reporters will not ask those questions, like, or they will just be like, this person was poor and that's the end. But it's like, no, what does that really mean? Like, how does that poverty connect to either being the victim of a crime or a perpetrator of a crime?
Just to quickly pick up that thread, so much of this writing is focused on trials, and trials lack context, right? They're like the most stripped down 10% tip of an iceberg of what actually happened and who those people are and who their communities are and how they got to that moment and all the things that we as storytellers can provide. And so a lot of times I like to think about what we do as providing sort of the counter narrative. Like Sarah, your piece on the Central Park jogger rapist, where you talked about the women who were ignored all those years, who were really, who were assaulted by him. It's filling in those gaps that I think that's where this works the best and can help the most.
I think it's clear that so much hides in plain sight, and the best of true crime or crime narratives are able to pull those out and create something lasting and upend what we think we know, but actually we're still well on the path of knowing it. And we are kind of over time, even though there are lots of amazing questions in the Q&A, so I'm so sorry we didn't get to them. But I really just want to thank Pam and Emma and Rachel and Sarah for an amazing discussion that I know we will be taking offline and elsewhere. And thank you so much for attending our event tonight. And let's all, I guess, hold up our copies of this anthology, Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession, which you can buy at Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Sarah Weinman.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. This was, I could have listened to this for 2 more hours, truly. I think everybody could. Yes, please buy the book. I will be emailing everyone with links to buy the book and also links for all the other books that these amazing women have written. And I just want to take a second to say congratulations to Sarah Marshall, who her podcast just recently hit #1 on the history section. We're wrong about, so definitely check that out. Again, I'll send you guys a link to subscribe to that. And happy birthday to Emma Eisenberg.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Emma.
Here, let it be a good one, 2020.
Hopefully this was a good way to spend your birthday. Thank you so much, everyone. Please go buy this book. It is brilliant. It's amazing. There's so much that this conversation could not contain that the book includes. And just thank you all so much for taking the time out to be here with us tonight.
Thank you, Brittany, for shepherding this amazing event. And thank you all. It was so much fun. Let's do this again soon and in person.
Fingers crossed. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.